And the last thing I'll mention before I dive into things is that all of these tips and tools are going to be based around the desktop version of iNaturalist, so using it on your computer rather than using it on your phone. However, if you do have questions about using it on your phone, please certainly feel free to ask those as well, and I can answer those as well. But certainly the things that I'll be showing you on my screen will be all desktop based. Great Southern BioBlitz acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we all join the meeting from, wherever you guys may be around Australia. And we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So what I might do first is just quickly answer those questions in the chat first. That's probably the best way to go about it. And then I'll dive into dealing with all the stuff I'm going to teach you. So Eileen said, how do we get observations ID'd? Do they just show up on someone else's page and they ID it, or do they need to look up our profile? So that's a great question. So there are lots and lots of different ways that people can find your observations. So every time you add an observation to iNaturalist, it goes into a big pool, essentially. So you'll see that if I click this Explore button, this shows all the observations that everyone has uploaded so far that have some kind of photo attached to them or some kind of sound file, and that have a location and a date. And I'll get to those important details later. But basically, you can see over 81 million observations. So every single time you upload an observation, it will automatically go into this big pool. So anyone who is browsing with this Explore tool will be able to see your observations. And then if they want to ID them, all they have to do is click on the photo. And we wait for it to load, and then they can go ahead and add an ID on your observation. Similarly, there's another tab called the Identify tab, and I'll go through both of these tabs in more detail a little bit later. And this is pretty much the same concept. So it's just a different way of viewing all those observations, but the exact same thing applies. This is a way for everyone to see observations. And once again, anytime you upload your observation, it will automatically go into this pool. So that's one way for people to ID your things, right? Is they're just sitting in that automatic pool. And you can see, for example, here's a mistletoe bird. I can click agree. And I've just made an identification for that person. So that's one way that your observations will get ID'd. Another way is that many users who are looking to identify things for you will specifically search for certain groups of organisms. So I ID a lot of mollusks in Australia. So what I can do is I can type in mollusks in the search bar. I can pick the drop-down option. Then for location, I can refine this to Australia. And I'm now looking at all observations of mollusks in Australia. So I can open up that one. This one certainly is Granata imbricata. That's a correct ID. So I click agree, and I've now added an ID, and that's now moved to research grade. So that's another way, right? So people can either look at a giant pool of all observations and sift through them all, or often people will specifically search for certain groups of organisms or certain places, or combinations of those two. The final way to get people to identify your observations for you is by tagging. So this functions in exactly the same way as any kind of tagging on social media, where you type in the @ symbol on an observation, and then you type in that user's username. So for example, if I go to one of my observations from today, now this is what I am pretty sure is a molt from a stick mantis that I found today, but I'm not 100% sure. So what I can do to try and get someone to help identify this for me is type in the @ symbol, and then you have to figure out who are the top identifiers of praying mantises in Australia. So I can go back to my page. You can see that I've still got Australia set to be the place. I can now type in praying mantises. I can now press this tab, which says identifiers, and that tab will show me who the top identifiers are of praying mantises in Australia. And you can see straight away, Matthew Connors, 7,000 IDs out of almost 7,000 observations. So he's added identifications to almost every single praying mantis observation in Australia. He's an absolute whiz. So I can go back, I can type in that @ symbol, and I can start typing in his username, and you'll notice a little drop down will appear, and I can just click that. And you just add some kind of comment. And you click done. And now he'll get a notification. And when he opens that notification, he'll be able to see this observation, and then he can help identify for me. So those are multiple ways that you can get your observations identified by other users. All right, Eileen's next question. For the BioBlitz, if I have the same bird at different locations, is it better to create multiple observations or just have one observation of that bird? If by the same bird you mean the same individual bird, then you can certainly merge those into one observation. But if I see a magpie at the side of the path and I take a photo and make an observation, and then I walk 200 meters along and I see another magpie that's a different individual, definitely make multiple observations. So on iNaturalist, an observation is meant to be an encounter with an organism at a time and place. So if you see 4, 5, 6 different rainbow lorikeets at 6 different locations on your walk, by all means, upload those as 6 different observations. Eileen also said, is there a way to make iNaturalist faster? By the time you've taken a photo and selected OK, the bird or bug has moved away before the next photo can be taken. Also, the time to load a new observation takes time if you've got multiple observations at the same location. Okay, so this is, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, Eileen, an app-related question. My biggest piece of advice for people using the app is don't use the camera in the iNaturalist app, and don't upload things while you're on the go. Use the normal camera on your phone and just take all your photos. And then once you get home, then you can upload all of your photos. And that really, really helps with that issue of time, where you're taking a photo and then you're having to click all these extra buttons in the app. And then by the time you've sorted everything out, exactly as Eileen says, the bug has disappeared, or the bird has flown away, or the plant is blown in the wind. So my biggest piece of advice for app users is just use the base camera on your phone, take as many pictures as you want, and then do all the uploading when you get home. And actually, the great thing about this BioBlitz is that once the 4 days end, there'll actually be a 2-week period afterwards where you can still take your time to upload all of your photos. So your photos do not have to be uploaded in that 4-day period. You only have to take the photos in that 4-day period. And you've got an extra 2 weeks afterwards to be able to upload them. Station 23 said, wondering how often iNaturalist uploads its information to the Atlas of Living Australia. Very, very often. I don't know the exact figure, but it's something on the order of 2 to 3 days. So pretty much every 2 to 3 days, iNaturalist will port all of its updated IDs and new observations over to the Atlas of Living Australia. So it's a pretty fast process. Linda said, let us know when you're doing another advanced course. Certainly, I don't know if any are planned for the near future, but certainly next year there'll definitely be some. I'm not sure if there'll be some later this year, but we'll definitely let everyone know if there are. L63 said, hi, I've joined a project, but I don't understand how to specifically add the images to the project. So if people know the project link in iNaturalist, how do you get images from your page and then get it into your project? Yeah, so that there's a few different ways you can do that, and I'll go through that extensively in a second, and I'll tell you how to add your stuff. David said, could you give a bit of an overview of iNaturalist and the BioBlitz? Sure, I'll give a 1-minute spiel here. So pretty much iNaturalist is an online biodiversity citizen science platform. And what that means is that you have users from all around the globe, where all you need to do is have an internet connection to participate. So it's completely free. And it doesn't matter whether you are a professional scientist or a complete amateur. All you have to do is take photos of any organism you encounter, or you can also do sound recordings, and then you upload them to the platform. If you already know what they are, that's fantastic. But if you don't know what they are, then other users from all around the world can identify those observations for you. And then one of the best parts is that once they've been identified, your data gets exported to other databases, such as the Atlas of Living Australia, and the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And then your data can actually be used in real life research by professional scientists from around the world. So that's iNaturalist. In terms of the BioBlitz, so BioBlitzes are generally, you have a defined place and a defined time. And then the goal in that place and time is to try and see as many species and make as many observations as possible. So in our case, we've got a BioBlitz occurring across all of the Southern Hemisphere in major cities and regions across Africa, South America, Australia, and the Pacific. And that's going to be running from the 22nd to the 25th of October. And so you've pretty much got 4 days to try and see as many species as you possibly can within your area. All right, so Simone said, does it only work in Australia? I'm in South Africa. So absolutely it will work in South Africa. iNaturalist is global, so it's in pretty much every single country on the planet. So you are definitely good to go for South Africa. Lockie said, is there an etiquette with tagging? Will it be rude to tag someone you haven't had contact with or who hasn't previously identified another one of your observations? That's a fantastic question. So certainly it's not rude to tag someone you haven't had contact with before, but there are a few little pieces of etiquette that I generally try to advise with tagging. One is to wait a little bit. Some people are certainly very enthusiastic. But what they'll do is they'll upload an observation and a photo, and then within 2 minutes of it being up, they'll instantly tag people. Always give it, I'd say, at least a day or two, if not more, for people to have a look at it and identify it of their own accord before tagging someone. So in many cases, obviously, there are cases where you have obscure organisms that end up slipping between the cracks, and tagging is the best way to get those ID'd. But certainly if you've got something like a plant or a bird or something like that, if you just give it a bit of time, it will naturally get identified itself. So always just give it a little bit of time before you tag someone. My second piece of advice is always try and have a go if you can at identifying things yourself. A lot of times I'll get tagged in observations where it's a really, really easy thing to identify. If the person had spent kind of 5 minutes exploring and having a look at photos themselves. And I don't mind, to be honest. I'll obviously still identify those things for people, and I'm always happy to help. But I know that there are some users out there that aren't too happy if someone tags them in their observation and they haven't even attempted to try and identify it themselves. So it's always best to, even if you have no idea what something is, always just have a bit of a stab at it yourself. And certainly if you do manage to identify something yourself, it always, I feel, ends up being more satisfying than if you tag someone else and they identified it. And my final piece of advice is, rather than just straight up tagging someone, I always like to add a little comment as well. So you see here, instead of just tagging Matthew, it's very simple. It doesn't even really mean anything in the comment, but at least I added a comment. And then if they do identify it for you, always just say a thank you. That's always appreciated. Simone said, how does copyright of images work? Do you upload low-res images only? So by default, all users have an account where the copyright is set to CC BY NC from memory. You can check your copyright by going to your profile settings. And we'll go to account, maybe. I can never remember. Where is my copyright? Here we go. Okay, so if you go to edit your profile, so I'll go back for people who didn't see what I clicked on. So if you go to the profile tab here, if you click on the profile tab, and then you click the big blue button under your profile picture, which says edit account settings and profile. And then you click on content and display on the left-hand side. And then you scroll down a bit, you'll see there's a heading that says licensing. So by default, all of your photos will be licensed as CC BY NC. And you can click this link here, which has a nice explanation of what all the different licenses mean. And so you can see here as well, this is the default license, and this is what I have. Now, you can actually change that at any time whatsoever. So you can see there's heaps of different options here. So these range all the way from no copyright, which means people can pretty much use your photos for whatever they like, including commercial profit, all the way down to no license, all rights reserved, which means people cannot use your photos and data for anything, absolutely anything, unless they get your express permission. So you've then got a whole lot of options in between. One little thing you'll notice is that there are these little buttons on each of these that tell you what happens. So you'll see that for the first 3 options, it means that your data will get sent over to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And I think the ALA has the same settings, but it might also accept this one. I'm not 100% sure. So you are completely welcome to either change all of your observations to a new licensing or just individual observations. So for example, there are many professional photographers who use iNaturalist. And of course, they're often selling many of their photos on their own websites. So they'll often set their observations to all rights reserved. But if you are happy to have your observations used in external databases and things like that, then I would recommend just keeping it on the default that was set when you created your account. Simone also said, so do you upload low-res images only? You are welcome to upload any resolution image that you like. The one thing to keep in mind is that iNaturalist will compress it to a certain size. So you can't upload photos that are bigger than 20 megabytes. And it will also, iNat will change it. It also has a maximum resolution, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but you are more than welcome to upload however large or low resolution images that you like, but just keeping in mind, if it's super high res, iNaturalist will compress it. Lucky Malala also said, are there keys that are easy to use for kids, especially for insects and fungi? Yes to the insects, not necessarily to the fungi. I might delve more into that question a bit later. Linda said, how does it work when someone can use the same boundary as you for a project of their own? I'll get to that one a bit later. All right, so we've got through all our questions. So we'll dive into things now. So continue to put the questions in whenever you think of them. But I will go through some of the basic functions of iNaturalist now. So obviously the kind of most basic thing you can do on iNaturalist is upload observations. So whenever you want to upload your observations, you just go to this big green button at the top and you press upload, and that will take you to this screen. And you've got 2 options. Well, you've got a few options actually. You can click choose files here, and then that will take you to a folder on your computer where you can select your photos. Or if you have that folder open, you can physically click the photos, and then you can just physically drag them over, and you can drag and drop. So that's another way to do things. So here we've got our 4 photographs ready to upload. So several important things on the screen. You'll notice that for each observation, there are 3 important pieces of data. And these are the species name, the date and time that you saw the observation, and then the location. And it's really important that you have all of these for various reasons that I'll explain. I'll delve into the date and the location first. So I'd say 99% of the time, whether you're taking a photo on your phone or your camera, the date and the time should automatically be filled in. That's always something that's typically already associated with the photo. However, if for whatever reason the date and time are wrong, it's very simple to change those. You just click on the bar, you'll have a little calendar pop up, and then you can just page through the months and then click the date that you want. If it's a really old photo that you're uploading, you can click on the year here. Instead of having to flick through every single month manually, you can actually just click on the month. That will pop you to a view like this. If you click on it again, now you've got multiple years you can select. Click on it on the arrows, and then you can page through all the years. And it's really easy to set your date. So that's the same thing applies if you have no date. So there are some cases where your photo might not have a date attached. For example, if you had taken a photo, uploaded it to Facebook, and then sent it to someone in a message and then re-downloaded it, that'll actually strip the date in a lot of cases and the location. So in those cases, the same thing applies. You just click in the date bar, you can page through the months, and then you click the date that applies. One thing you'll notice is that it'll then autofill the time to whatever the time is right now. If you know that that wasn't the time when you saw this species, you can just delete it. So you don't actually need to have the time in your date. You can just have the date. That's perfectly fine. So if you can't remember the time, or you know the time is wrong, you can just delete that. In terms of the location, that may or may not always be there. So if you're taking photos with your phone and you have your location services on, then the location will be automatically embedded. Similarly, if you are taking photos with a camera that has a geotagging, it will also have location. But there are many, many cameras that do not have inbuilt geotagging. So in those cases, you have to add the location manually. So to do that, you just click the bar, and then you've got multiple different options. You can search for the location. So this functions just like searching Google Maps. And indeed, that's exactly what iNaturalist uses. So I can type in Duck River. I can click it, and then that'll take me to the location. And then I can manually scroll all the way in. So just using my mouse wheel, and I can say, yes, I remember I saw the butterfly at this exact spot. And then I just click the blue update button, and it's now added the location. Another way to do it is you can actually just physically enter the latitude and longitude if you know them, or you can just scroll and drag on the map. That's perfectly fine as well. So I can just scroll on the map, go into a particular spot and say, okay, I found it here, click on that point on the map, and away we go. You'll also notice when I click on a point on the map, this red circle appears with the little white handles. This is the accuracy circle. And what it's saying is that I saw this butterfly, or I saw this species that I observed somewhere in this circle. So this is a great way to indicate uncertainty. So you might say, well, I remember I was at Longreef Headland and I took a photo of this butterfly, but I can't remember exactly where I was along this path. So what I'll do is I'll put my point down, and then I'll expand the edges of the circle until they cover all the possible points where I could have been. And that is perfectly okay. So this is a great way, this is a great technique to use if you're not 100% sure where you actually saw an organism. The final thing about location is you'll notice there's this little bar here called geo-privacy, and there are three options: open, obscured, and I'll just move this bar out of the way. So there's open, obscured, and private. By default, all observations are set to open. And what this means is that anyone can see the coordinates and the location. If you set things to obscured, however, the observation has its coordinates scrambled. And what I mean by this is that if you set it to be obscured, iNaturalist will take the true coordinates of your observation. It will then create a roughly 500 square kilometer box. It's about 25 by 20 kilometers, depending where you are on the globe, around the true location. And then it will randomly place the coordinates inside that box. So for anyone else that is viewing your observation, it'll just look like a random point on the map in that 500 square kilometer box around the true location. And you can do this manually, and it can also happen automatically. So if, for example, you're taking photos around your house and you don't want people to know where you live, then you can manually set your observations to be obscured, and that's perfectly okay. However, if you take photos of any organism that has a conservation status of near threatened or above, so anything that's vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, it will automatically have its coordinates obscured, and you have no choice. And that's a thing that iNaturalist does to prevent things like poaching or collection. You can also set things to obscured if you think there is a collection risk. So for example, there are many rare orchids and similar plants where they're not necessarily endangered. They don't have an official conservation status, but people may be able to use iNaturalist to figure out where those orchids are and then go and collect them illegally. So that's another way that another use case for people obscuring their records. And finally, you can set things to private. I usually highly recommend against this, but I always like to explain it because it is an option. What private does is it completely destroys all location information. So not only will other users not be able to see the coordinates of your observation, they will not even be able to see the continent on which you took the photo. This does have very, very rare uses for things like, I've seen it used for extremely rare frogs and snakes in the Americas, and also some extremely rare plants in places like Papua New Guinea or Southeast Asia, where even that obscuration, where even if it's scrambled into a 500 square kilometer box, that may still provide enough clues for people to figure out where that observation was taken. So that is an option that you can use, but I don't recommend using it for kind of 99.9% of cases. But once you've decided on the location, you've got all your settings, you can click Update Observations. And so now we've filled out the location and we've filled out the date. I'll just quickly jump in. We've got 2 questions. Nope, all good. Okay, so another thing you'll notice is that I've got 1 photo of this butterfly, but I've got 3 photos of this particular beetle. Now on iNaturalist, every time you encounter an individual, it doesn't matter how many photos you take of it, they all need to be part of the same observation. So if I take 5 photos of a beetle, the same beetle at one place and one time, they all need to be combined into the same observation. And on the flip side of that coin, if I take 3 photos of 3 different beetles, they need to be 3 separate observations. So the easy way to remember it is, multiple photos of the one individual, all the same observation. Whereas if I have photos of different species and different individuals, they all need to be separate observations. So here I've got 3 photos of the same beetle, and what I want to do is combine them all into the one observation. And that's really easy. So what first I need to do is pick which photo I want to appear first. So I can have a look at them all and say, okay, there's photo 1. That's a pretty good view of the beetle. It shows most of the details. Here's photo 2. Not so great because it only shows the underside. Here's photo 3, a lateral shot, also decent. I decide that I want to have this one appear as the first photo. So all I have to do is physically pick up the other photos with my mouse and then drag them onto the first one. Pick it up and drag it. And so you'll see that now all of these are combined. And you'll see that there are 3 photos that are all part of the same observation. One thing I will keep in mind there is you'll actually notice that if you only pick up the photo itself, it will only move the photo in some cases, and you'll be left with this little blank observation that you saw before. So it's always best to click in the white edges around here, and that will actually pick up the whole thing and move it there. So now I've combined my 3 photos into one observation. So the final thing that I need to do here is add in my species names. Now, I mentioned this earlier. It does not matter if you have absolutely no idea what you saw and photographed. It is always, always best to add some kind of identification. Even if that is something as basic as animal or plant or fungus, that is far, far better than just leaving it blank. And the reason for that goes back to one of the things I discussed earlier, which is that many people who are identifying observations for others do so by specifically searching for groups of organisms. So if I search for mollusks, all observations of mollusks will turn up. But if you photographed a mollusk and uploaded it, but you didn't add an identification and you just left it blank, it will not appear in my search. So that's why it's really crucial to add an ID, even if it is something really basic. So in this case, I know exactly what this butterfly is. It's the species Graphium corydon, the blue triangle. So if I know what it is, that's great. And I can type in the name and I can add the ID, and that's perfectly fine. But let's say that I had no idea what this was, and I can just add in beetles, and that's perfectly fine. Let's say I didn't even know it was a beetle. I can just add in insects, and that is equally fine. You can even add in an ID of life. So that is sometimes an ID that I'll add. I'll occasionally encounter things where I'm like, I have no idea whether this is a fungus, a slime mold, an algae, a cyanobacteria. It's something very wacky, and I have no clue what it is. Just smack in an ID of life, and that is also fine because people aren't going to be searching for the category of life specifically. But if you leave this observation, this ID bar blank, it will go into the unknown pool, which makes it a lot more difficult for people to search for things. I've got one more question in the chat. So Dassie said, how do you identify cocoons, nests, etc.? So that's a good question. So, I mean, if it's something like a bird nest and you know that it's definitely a bird nest, but you're not sure which species of bird, then by all means, just type in bird there. But, you know, if you really have no idea if it's a spider cocoon or an insect cocoon or something like that, you can just put an ID of animals. And then if you want to try and actually figure it out yourself, what it is, I'll go through how you can do that in a second. The final thing I'll mention here before we upload these is that you'll notice that when I click in this species bar, there's actually a little drop-down menu appears. And this is iNaturalist's computer vision. And what I mean by that is that iNaturalist has this artificial intelligence that can guess or provide suggestions as to what it thinks your photographs are of. So if anyone who's ever used something like Google Lens or many plant ID apps that exist online, it's pretty much the same principle. So the computer vision program, it sees your photograph and then it tries to match it to its massive pool of photos it has, and then it offers these suggestions. But there are several caveats when you're using it. So first of all, the computer vision is better for species that it has more photographs of. So that's kind of logical, right? If you have something like rainbow lorikeets, where there are tens of thousands of observations and photos that have been uploaded to iNaturalist, the computer vision is really great at recognizing rainbow lorikeets. Not only because there are so many photos that there have been uploaded, and so it has heaps of photos to draw on as reference images, but also rainbow lorikeets are very, very charismatic, instantly recognizable, colorful, easy to photograph. It's something that even if you're a complete amateur naturalist, you can recognize them, right? The same thing goes for many mammals, things like koalas or kangaroos, a lot of tropical fish, butterflies, things like that. But then when you start dealing with more obscure things like tiny land snails or black and brown beetles, the computer vision starts to really struggle. And there's two different reasons for that. One is that for many species, it doesn't have enough photographs and observations for that species to actually be in the computer vision. So if there's a species that has only ever been uploaded once or twice or 10 times to iNaturalist, it will not be able to suggest that species for you. There is a minimum threshold for the computer vision to be able to suggest that species. On a similar note, the computer vision is heavily biased towards Northern Hemisphere species. And the simple reason for that is that there are far more observations and photos from the Northern Hemisphere. So iNaturalist started off in California. And certainly, if you look at those 80 million observations on the platform so far, almost half of them are from the USA alone. And then if you add in Canada, Mexico, and places like the UK, you have a huge proportion of all the observations on iNaturalist. So it means that in many cases, when people upload photos from South Africa or New Zealand or Australia, it doesn't recognize those species. So what it will do instead is it will suggest North American species that look similar. So of course, those don't end up being correct. And that's a really common way for misidentifications to occur on iNaturalist. So one really cool change that iNaturalist actually introduced earlier this year in January is that it will now only suggest things that are nearby by default. So what it means by nearby is that it will only suggest similar looking things that have been seen within 100 kilometers and also, I believe, within the same month of the year, plus or minus a month. You can actually turn that off. So you'll see there's a little button at the bottom here which says include suggestions not seen nearby. That drop down now increases, and you'll now notice that every single one of these options does not occur in Australia. So all of these are things that are not Australian. And you can check that by clicking this view button. So if you're looking at all of these options and you're not sure which one to pick, all you got to do is click this view button. You'll get taken to the species page for that particular organism. And you'll scroll down and you can see here, there's a nice map. And you can see, okay, all of the observations are in China, South Korea, Taiwan, and then a few over here in India, which are probably misidentified. But you'll see it's pretty much a Northeast Asian species. So we can be pretty confident that's not what our beetle is. And then similarly, if I do that again, and I pick something like this, the checkered melon beetle, and we'll have a look, and we can say, okay, every single observation is in the central United States. So you can say, okay, it's probably not that. But if we go back and we turn back on to only suggesting things seen nearby, it suggests this genus, Olicophora. And if we click view, we can scroll down and we can say, hey, presto, there are heaps of observations in Australia. So that may not necessarily mean it is correct, because you'll see there are also many observations throughout Southeast Asia and continental Asia. But certainly there are many observations of this genus in Australia. So that seems like a pretty good bet. And indeed, in this case, it is correct. This beetle is Orlicophora hylaris. So I can type that in and pick it. One thing you'll notice there is that it's not enough to just type in the name of the species. You have to actually click the little drop-down option that appears as well. Otherwise, it will not work. And we'll just test the species, the computer vision here as well, just to prove that it does pretty well. And you can see, yep, Graphium corydon, which is the correct species, is the top suggestion. And then all you have to do is click your green button up here, submit observations, and you have uploaded your photographs to iNaturalist. And it's as simple as that. So I've just got a couple more questions. So Lukeman said, what if you have a number of birds you see at once, but can only photograph one of them? To just clarify that question, do you mean multiple birds of the same species, or do you mean multiple birds across multiple species? So if you could just type that into multiple birds, one species, sweet. Okay, that's perfectly fine, absolutely fine. So if you can only photograph one of them, that is totally fine. A really important thing to realize about iNaturalist is that it is not a tool for measuring abundance. It is a tool for measuring presence only. So iNaturalist doesn't deal well with abundance, because if I take a photo of 100 fish in a school, that gets uploaded as one observation, and that is one data point. So that is basically counting it as one individual. So there are certain analyses and ways you can get around this, but for all intents and purposes, don't feel that you have to take all individuals in a group. If you just get a photo of one, that's perfectly fine. And then Lockie Malala said, what if you see animals, but they're gone before you can record a sound or take a photo? Can you create an observation with only a description? Yes, you can, but there is a catch. So let's say I see a bird and I bust my camera out, I'm about to take a photo and it flies off and I miss the photo. But I knew what the bird was. It was really easy to identify. It was very distinct. I can still add an observation. So what you would do in that case is you would go up to the top left-hand corner. You click this add button. You then click this second option, which says observation without media. And what that does is it creates a blank observation for you. So you then have to fill out the location manually. You have to fill out the date manually, and then you type in whatever you saw. So let's just say I saw a dusky wood swallow. I can click that. And then whenever I upload observations like this, I always like to write some little notes. So that's the last part of each observation. You'll notice that there's a little notes section. So I'll write something like, was too fast for me to get a photo, but unmistakable and easy to identify in the field. So you can then, so once I've obviously filled in my date and location, I can then upload that observation. However, the catch there is that your observation will remain as casual grade. And what I mean by casual grade. So if I open up a new tab, all observations on iNaturalist have one of three different labels: research grade, needs ID, or casual. Now, these are a little bit arbitrary, but there are some strict definitions for what each of them mean. So I'll show you examples of each. Okay. So this is a research grade observation. And you'll see that it has this big green label up here, which says research grade. And if you hover over it, you'll see a little description which says research grade observations have media. So that means they have either a photo or a sound recording attached. They have a location, they have a date, and a community consensus on a precise identification. And what that means, the community consensus bit. In order for something to be research grade, it needs to have at least two identifications, and that includes your original one. And more than 2/3 of these identifications must agree. So you'll see here, I added an ID of slender rice flower. Someone else added an ID of slender rice flower. There are now 2 IDs. 2 out of 2 is 100%, which is more than 2/3. So this is now research grade. However, if someone came along, a third person, and they added a different ID, now only 2 out of 3 agree, which is not more than 2/3. It's equal to 2/3, which means this will now shift back to having a yellow label, which says needs ID. So in order for something to be research grade, it needs to have 2 out of 2 identifications agreeing, or 3 out of 3, or 3 out of 4, or 4 out of 5, 5 out of 6, and so on and so forth. And obviously, the more people you have adding IDs, the more people you need to be in agreement. On top of this nice little green label appearing, if something is research grade, it means that observation and the data associated with it will now get exported to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And that is an external aggregator. It's a biodiversity aggregator. And what I mean by that is it's pretty much this global biodiversity platform that takes in biodiversity data from all kinds of sources. And that includes iNaturalist, museum collections, eBird, you name it. It has almost 2 billion records. And it's basically like the global version of the Atlas of Living Australia. So unless your observation is research grade, it will not go to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. One thing to note is that it's a little bit of a misnomer. Just because it's labeled as research grade, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a correct ID. So things that are labeled as research grade can certainly be wrong. It doesn't mean that it will be used in research. It just means that it has a photo, it has a location, it has a date, and more than 2/3 of people agree on what the ID is. Then you have needs ID, which is this little yellow label. And you'll see that a needs ID observation, it has media, it has location, it has date, so all the same things as research grade, but it still requires community consensus. So you'll see here, I uploaded this, I said it was this species, and now I'm just waiting for someone to either confirm or correct. So at the moment, because I'm the only one that's added an ID, it's still sitting at needs ID. The final grade is this gray label, which is casual. And when you hover over it, you'll see it says casual observations are missing one or combination media. So if you have no photo attached, it will be casual. If you don't have a date observed, it'll be casual. If you don't have a location, it'll be casual. And then if you have so if you scroll all the way down the bottom of any observation, there's this big section called the data quality assessment. If any of these options are downvoted, it will also move the observation to casual. So for example, date is accurate. So as one good example of this, there are many dragonflies and damselflies that only ever emerge as adults at a very specific time of the year. So let's say for this particular species, it's May. And that's without exception, this species only ever emerges as an adult in May. And I upload an observation and I say that the date I saw it was December. Straight away, that seems like it's a bit iffy. And a possibility is I might have made up the date, or maybe I just entered it incorrectly. If someone comes along and they see that, they can downvote date is accurate, and that will make the observation casual. And then if I want to remove that, I can just click that again. The same thing goes for all of these options. If you think the location of something is inaccurate, so for example, let's say someone has a photo of an echidna in the bush, but the point on the map is way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, something's gone wrong. So what you can do is you can downvote location is accurate, but then very importantly, leave a comment for them. Because if you do one of these downvotes on someone's observation, they won't get any kind of notification. So they won't know that you downvoted it. So then you just leave a comment, something like, it seems like there's an issue with the location here. Would you please fix it? And then you just add that comment. And then once they've fixed the location, you can go back and you can undownvote it. The really important one, however, most of the time is organism is wild. And what this means is that if you have an observation of a pet cat or a pet dog or a pet bird or a potted plant or some kind of plant that you planted in your garden or animals in a zoo or plants that the council planted along the median strip or in a public park, those are treated as captive or cultivated organisms. And they need to have organism is wild downvoted because iNaturalist's main focus is on wild organisms. So if you take a photo of a pot plant that you have because you want to figure out what it is, that's totally fine, but just make sure you downvote for organism as wild. So those are the 3 different grades. And so coming back to my original point, if you upload an observation without a photo, that is fine, but it will mean it is casual. That then has some implications for where this photo appears. If you upload observations without a photo, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, they will not go into the BioBlitz, the Great Southern BioBlitz. Or are we accepting casual observations this year? Let me check. So if there are many projects that you can add your observations to, but quite a number of them.
I think we're actually, we're accepting casual observations.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
A lot of areas.
There are many projects that you can add your observations to. Fantastic. Okay, so ignore what I just said. You are perfectly fine to upload observations like this for the Great Southern BioBlitz, and they will get added to the project. But just as an aside, there are other assorted projects on iNaturalist that do not accept casual observations. They only accept research grade and needs ID. And it also means that your observations won't appear in the default search. So you'll notice that if I go to the Explore tab that I mentioned before, and then I go to filters, you'll see that by default, this verifiable box is ticked. And verifiable basically means that the observations being shown here are either research grade or needs ID. So a casual observation is considered to be non-verifiable. So it just means that your observation will be a bit harder for people to find unless they explicitly search for it. So we've got a few more questions in the chat. Okay. So Carol said, if we try to identify something ourselves, but really need it confirmed, can we enter the possible species and add a question mark? Absolutely, that's perfectly fine. So I'll do that quite a lot. I'll take a photo of a butterfly or a beetle and I'll do some research and I'll say, I think it's this species. Maybe I'm like 75% sure, but I'm still doubting myself a bit. So I can add the ID and then I'll add either a question mark or probably even better, a little comment and say something like, I'm not 100% sure of this ID. And then, if you are correct, someone will come along and confirm it, and that's fantastic. But equally, if you're wrong, then someone will come along and correct you, and then obviously you've learned something. So it is perfectly okay to add an ID if you are not 100% sure, but probably try to limit that. If you're probably only 50% sure, I would err on the side of caution and perhaps go up to genus or family or something that you're more certain of. Lockie Malala said, how do you filter/search for your casual observations? Great question. And this one is a little bit tricky. So this requires a little bit of URL editing. So if anyone is tuning in for the first time to one of my workshops, I've dealt with URL editing in quite a number of my other ones, but I'll give one tiny example just for casual things here. So you'll notice that if you click on the Your Observations tab, you'll see that there are certain strings of text in the URL up here. So you'll see it says place ID equals any. So that means at the moment it's searching for all of my observations, regardless of what place I saw them. It says user ID equals the beachcomber. So that's just saying that it's showing all of my observations just from me. And you'll see it says verifiable equals any. So that means it's showing all of my observations at the moment, research grade, needs ID, and casual. So let's say that, however, I only want to find my own casual observations. It's a little bit tricky. So normally, if I wanted to see only my research grade or only my needs ID observations, it's really easy. I can go to this filters box in the top right-hand corner, and then I can either tick the research grade button, and now I'm only seeing my research grade observations, and you'll see that all of these have the green label on them. Or if I untick that, I can click the needs ID button, and now I'm only seeing needs ID, right? But you'll notice that there is no casual button there. And so what you have to do is you have to actually manually edit the text in this URL. So what you'll do is just click the research grade button, and when you click it, you'll notice that an extra bit of, if you watch the URL carefully, as I'm clicking this button and unclicking it, you'll see an extra piece of text appears in the URL, and that's this bit of text. that says quality grade equals research. If I want to search for all of my casual observations, all I have to do is highlight the word research and instead type casual, press enter. And now I'm only looking at my casual observations. So you'll see these are a mix of things where I saw a particular species, but I missed out on a photograph. So I just uploaded it using that process before. Or here's a plant I took a photo of that was planted by the council in my local park. So that one is casual. And you can just scroll down and you see here's some pet cats I found stalking around this reserve that I'm surveying. Here's some more plants that are planted. So you'll see, so here's a dead sheep head that I found that someone so kindly dumped into my local bushland. So that's the way to find your casual observations, is you go to the filters, you tick that research grade box, and then in the URL, you replace the word research with casual. So that's a really nice, easy way to do it. Okay, so WW2980 said, what if you just have a bird call but are unable to see the bird? Will this remain casual? So no, so calls are perfectly okay. So if you are able to record a bird call or a cicada call or any kind of sound file with either your camera or your phone, that is perfectly okay. You can upload sound files just like you would a photo, and it will be eligible for research grade, and that's perfectly fine. So you just upload it in exactly the same way that you would upload a photo. So if I'm on my upload screen, I just click the add button, and then you'll see the option is photos or sounds. The one thing to note is that iNaturalist does not accept videos. So you have to actually upload a sound file such as an M4A. So what I do, so obviously if you're taking, usually when you're recording sounds using your phone or your camera, you're recording video as well. So unless you've got some actual special kind of microphone that only records audio files, it will record it as a video. So what I do is I use a video to sound file converter. And the main one that I use and I find is really good is this one. And I'll put the link in the chat for everyone. So this is completely free, very quick, very simple to use. I'll just put this in the chat if I can find where my chat's gone. So that's the link that I use. So what I do is I'll have taken my video on my camera. I've uploaded that onto my computer. I just go to this site, Online Audio Converter. I click Open Files, the big blue button. That'll take me to this screen. I don't know if I actually have any videos here, but let's just pretend this is a video. I select my video. You then click this button, M4A, then click Best. Once this has loaded, the bar has loaded. So normally this will work, but obviously it doesn't work here because I'm trying to do this with a photo. You then go down to this button here, which will turn blue, and you click Convert. That'll take you to a new screen, and then there's a big button which says Download. And you just download that new audio file to your computer, and then you go back and you just upload it like this, and you can upload your sound file, and it works perfectly. So certainly, by all means, if you can hear a bird, but you can't manage to get a photo of it, just record a video with your phone or your camera, go online, convert that video to an M4A file, and then you can upload that as you would a photo. DN Smith said, if someone or the greater than 2 out of 3 disagree with your identification, is it your responsibility to correct the species name? So that's a fantastic question. So there is a whole lot of complicated etiquette and protocol around what happens with IDs. So you've got multiple options. So let's say I have this observation again, where I was pretty sure I knew what this flower was. I had someone come along and they even added they added an agreeing ID. So I'm like, okay, it seems like this is correct. But then your third person comes along and they disagree and they add an ID for a different species. You've got 3 different options. One is to just leave your ID as is, and that's fine because nothing will happen to it. And you can just wait and see if other people will weigh in as well. So maybe, just because someone comes along and corrects your ID doesn't necessarily mean they're correct. They might be wrong as well. So the first option is you can just leave things for now, and you can wait and see if a 4th or a 5th or a 6th person weigh in. and maybe they'll agree with you, or maybe they'll agree with the correcting ID. Another option you can do is you can change your ID. So let's say someone else comes along and adds an ID of species X. You do a little bit of research, you compare photos, and you realize, okay, yes, I was wrong the first time. Species X is the correct one. Then you can just change your ID. So you can go back into the suggest an ID bar. You can type in the new species, and then you can add that. Or alternatively, if someone adds a different ID to yours, it'll show a little button here in the corner which says agree, and you can click agree, and then that will withdraw your old ID, and then it will add a new ID. The third option is to withdraw, and this is the one that I usually do. So if someone comes along and they add a different ID to mine, often I'll not be sure. So I'll be like, okay, I'm not 100% sure if I'm correct. I'm not sure if they're correct. Or alternatively, I might say, okay, I definitely know that I'm wrong. I know that this person is correct, but I probably still wouldn't be able to identify this myself if I saw it again. In that case, all you have to do is withdraw your ID. And that you do that by going to this little down arrow next to your ID, click that, and then you just click this button withdraw. That will then remove your ID, and then it will either shift to the new ID that's been added, or it might go back to genus, for example, here. So because this user still has their slender rice flower ID there, it'll still be at a coarser level. But if you have an observation like, say, this one, where I'm the only one that has added an ID, and then someone else comes along and corrects me and says that my ID was wrong, if I just click that withdraw button, the overall ID will change to whatever that person added. So ultimately, the answer to that question is it depends. It depends on the situation and the context. So if you are very confident that that person is correct, and that you are confident if you saw that species again in the field, you would be able to identify it independently, then by all means, click agree with them and change your ID. But unless you know that you can confidently ID that species again by yourself, the best option is always to withdraw. So a really, really common thing that you'll find with new users is that if someone IDs something for them, they'll just kind of blindly hit the agree button. In a lot of cases, almost as like a way of saying thank you. And a lot of times people will feel obligated to just blindly agree with someone else who's added an ID. That's not the best practice, because if that other person was wrong, now you've got 2 wrong IDs instead of just 1. So unless you're 100% sure and agree with them, just withdraw your ID, and that's totally fine. Hannah said, how long do sound files usually need to be? What is the maximum length? Sound files can be any length. I have uploaded sound files that are 2 seconds long. I've uploaded sound files that are 5 minutes long when I was listening to a lyrebird calling. Sound files tend to be extremely low file sizes. And so even if you have a really, really long file, it's only going to be 1 or 2 megabytes at most. And that's no problem, because you can upload files up to 20 megabytes. So there is no minimum or maximum length for a sound file in terms of the time, but the maximum file size you can have is 20 megabytes. But you'd really have to put in a bit of an effort to reach that. I'd say you'd have to have a sound recording for, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 minutes to actually reach that length. And even if you have something that long, you can actually compress it further to make it smaller if need be. So 99.9% of the time, you can upload any sound file you want and it will be completely fine. Dassy said, do you generally upload photos taken in the field on your PC? Yes, absolutely. Even if I'm taking photos of my phone, I will use my cord to connect to my computer. I'll shift those photos to my computer and then upload them that way, because it's so much faster. You'll see in this screen, you can upload 100, 200 observations at once. Whereas if obviously you're in the app, you're restricted to uploading a single observation at a time, and you can only add photos in batches of 4 at a time. Whereas here, I can add up to 20 photos to a single observation at one time. And I regularly upload 100, even 150 observations simultaneously. So I would certainly recommend uploading things on your computer if you can. It's a lot more efficient and it will save you a lot of time. Linda said, what if you are loading a species that is not on the list, for example, for a subspecies not yet on the list? So yeah, for sure. So There are obviously heaps and heaps of species in iNaturalist. I think it's somewhere around 1 million, but there are always going to be obscure species or subspecies that aren't in the iNaturalist database yet. There are two different ways you can go about getting them into iNaturalist. One is by using this special tool. So let's say I had this photo of my weevil and I knew what the ID was, and I knew it was called species X. But when I added that ID, nothing appeared in the dropdown, and the species isn't in iNaturalist yet. What you want to do is you click this button here, search external name providers. What that does is it'll start searching in other databases, things like the Catalog of Life, Encyclopedia of Life, Plants of the World Online, and it will try and retrieve the name for you. And in a lot of cases, that will work. And it will get the name, and then you just click the little option that appears, and away you go. But in other cases, you still get very obscure. Sometimes when you click this button, it'll say no search results found. Because sometimes you obviously have very obscure species that might not be in some of the major databases, or you may have species or subspecies that are very recently described, and so they might not be added to any of these other platforms yet. In that case, what you need to do is you need to create a flag. So let's say I knew that the species was in the genus Oxyops. What I would do is I would go to the page for Oxyops. So now I'm on the page for this genus. I would scroll down a bit here. In the top right-hand corner above the map, you'll see there's this button which says curation. I'll click that button, and then I will click flag for curation. And then here in the bar, I'll type in, please add species X, and then I click flag it, and that creates a flag. And flags are pretty much an alert system that curators can see. So if I scroll down, you can see here, there's a little window here which says flags, and people, I can go in and then I can add the species manually for you. So those are the two ways of getting species in. Okay, I should check how much time I have. Stephen, how much time have I got left? I can't actually see the time on my computer with the way I have this set up.
It's 9:38 p.m. my time.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so certainly if you have to go, feel free to go because I have run over time as per usual. But I will probably go for another 20 minutes or so. So I'll probably go to around 10 o'clock. So if you're able to stick around, certainly feel free to stick around. If you do have to go, this will continue to be recorded and you can catch up on those last 20 minutes on the YouTube channel or on the Facebook page afterwards. So what I'm going to do with the last two things is I'm going to talk about identifying observations and I'm going to talk about projects. One little thing I'll say before that is you'll notice that earlier I tagged Matthew and asked him if he could confirm whether my thing was a stick mantis, and he's come along and he has confirmed. So that's a really nice example of how tagging people works. And within, so 8:42, 18, so within less than an hour, he was able to come along and confirm that ID for me. So that's a really nice example of tagging people and then coming along and able to confirm your IDs for you. So Luke said, is it the BioBlitz umbrella project we need to join? Yes, so there's two different projects you can join. You join the specific project for your area, and then you can also join the umbrella project as well. You don't strictly have to join them for your observations to count. Whether you join the project or not, your observations will still automatically go into the project. It just means that if you do join the project, then you will get updates such as journal posts appear in your feed. So let's say that you're in Sydney, like I am, and you wanted to join the project for that. You just go up to this big search bar at the top left-hand corner. You would type in Great Southern BioBlitz, Greater Sydney. Uh, 2021, and then you just click this About button. So that's important. Don't click View Observations. Make sure you click the About button. And then all you have to do is go up to the top right-hand corner here, and where it says Members, for me, it'll say Join for you, and you just click Join. You'll then get taken to another screen, and you just confirm, and then you're now part of this project. And then if you want to join the umbrella project, you just type in Great Southern Bioblitz. You start typing that. The umbrella should be the first one that appears at the top. Once again, you click About. And then the same thing applies. Where it says Leave, for me here, it'll say Join for you instead. If you haven't joined, you just click Join, and now you're a part of the project. So Michelle just posted a link to the umbrella project in there. So it has all the areas that are in it so far. So if, let's say that you are not sure whether the area that you live in has got an area set up, what you can do is you can click this little view more and you can scroll through here and you can either manually scroll through and read all the labels, or you can use Control F on your keyboard and then start typing in the name, and then you can see whether your place is there. Or alternatively, you can scroll down to the map and you can see all the places that have signed up. And then you can use the plus minus. And it's a little bit clunky, but you can see Fiji is taking part, the wet tropics, Sunshine Coast, and you can just keep zooming in and you can check whether the area around you. So you can see Clarence Valley, Coffs Harbour, and that's the way to find whether your area or your city is participating. And yeah, so it's also the feature project. So I might before I dive into projects, I'll deal with one other thing. But if you click on this community tab at the top of your screen, you'll see that the second option is projects. If you then go to projects, you'll see it's the big featured project here. And so this is a nice way to see all kinds of projects, but I'll delve into them a little bit later. Also, can I note, either Michelle or Stephen, can you please tell me when there is 2 minutes left to go to 10 o'clock so I don't go until midnight?
No worries.
Thanks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go through how you can browse through other people's observations before I get into projects. So anytime you ever want to either just look at other people's observations because you're interested in them, or you want to see what kinds of species are being seen in the area around you, because maybe you want to use that to go out and find things yourself, or you want to try and figure out what some of your own things are, you always use this Explore tab. So you just click Explore and then make sure you put in a location. Now that can be something as broad as Australia, or you can specify a state, a town, an individual place. Let's say we'll go for Greater Sydney. So one thing to note is if you ever want to search for observations in Sydney, don't search for Sydney. You need to search for Greater Sydney because Sydney is actually this very tiny specific area around the suburb of Sydney in the city. So now I'm seeing that there are 231,500 observations so far that have been uploaded to Sydney. And I can look at all of them if I want, so I don't have to specify a particular group of organisms, and I can slowly just scroll down. And then if I see an interesting one, I can click on it and it'll take me to that specific page. And I can, if you want, you can agree if you think that is the correct observation, the correct ID, so that this is definitely Queensland silver wattle. But then the problem is, if you want to go back to that view, you have to click the back button and constantly go back and forth. So what I would advise is if you do want to go through a page like this and browse through other people's photos, I would right-click on each photo and click Open Link in New Tab. And that way I've got the observation in a new tab there, and I've still got this page open. Now, if I want to scroll down through this page, each page only has 96 observations on it. So if I scroll all the way to the bottom, there are 96 observations on each page, and then I can click onto the next page, right? And that's one way to go about things. Alternatively, you can do things through the Species tab view. So if I click this Species tab here, I can now see all the different species. Rather than seeing individual observations that people have uploaded, I can see what are all the different species that people have uploaded for Greater Sydney. Now, the way that these are ordered is descending order from the most observed down to the least observed. So you'll see that the most observed species in Greater Sydney is the Australian white ibis, and then the second most observed is the cockatoo, then magpie, lorikeet, so on and so forth. And then as you scroll down, you'll slowly see all the most observed species for Sydney. But the problem is, you'll notice that for Sydney, there are over 8,000 species that have been observed. But if I'm on this Species tab view, it will only ever show you 500 different species at once. It is physically impossible to show more than that. So if I want to see some of the things that are right down at the bottom, I have to refine my search. And I can do this by using this species tab. So for example, let's say I wanted to see all the butterflies that have been seen in Greater Sydney. I can type in butterflies, I can click that tab. There have been almost 2,500 observations of butterflies uploaded to iNaturalist for the Greater Sydney region across 80 species. So that's very easy to scroll through. You'll see here on the species tab. As I slowly scroll down, you'll see all the way from the most observed, the cabbage white. And then if I scroll down all the way to the bottom, you'll go down to the rarest butterflies, well, not necessarily the rarest, I should say the least observed, all the way down to these ones that only have one observation. So things like the coppery penciled blue, or the blue banded egg fly, or the silver studded ochre. These are all butterflies that there's only been a single observation so far for Greater Sydney on iNaturalist. I've got 2 questions. Thanks, Carol. There's multiple different ways. So alternatively, again, I can just scroll through all the individual observations if I want. Or let's say that I was only interested in seeing observations of meadow argus butterflies, which is my favorite type of butterfly. I just click this little link here where it says 167 observations. I click that. And now I'll be taken to all the observations of the meadow argus in Sydney. And you can see there are some absolutely fantastic photos. I can never get photos that are this good of this butterfly. What you can also do is you can click on the species name and you'll be taken to the page for that species. So you'll see here, instead of clicking this 167 observations link, I can actually click the name meadow argus there. This will take me to the special species page for this species. And you'll see there are all kinds of stats here. So you can see who the top observer of this species is, who the top identifier is, when the last observation was. So the last observation was yesterday. How many total observations. There's a really cool seasonality graph. So this shows you when most of the observations of this species are made. So you'll see that this species observations peak quite dramatically in April and then drop off from there. So this is one really cool way of trying to find things. So let's say I had never seen a meadow argus before, and I was trying to figure out both when and where I should go to try and find this species. Well, I can look at when. So I can say, okay, my best bet is probably sometime from February to May. There are certainly, literally hundreds of observations in these other times, but probably to maximize my chances, I should go somewhere from February to May, because that's when the most gets seen. And then if you scroll down, you'll see there's also a big map. So if I scroll in on the map and I can go to my area around Greater Sydney, and I'll say, okay, I live in the suburb of Sefton. So this is around where I live. I can say, okay, there's been 3 observations here in this reserve. Or if I go further up in this reserve, there's been 4 observations here. So this is a really cool way to allow me to plan my trips and to try and target certain species. So now I know that if I want to try and find this butterfly species, I know that the particular time of year when I have the most likelihood of seeing the species. And I've also figured out roughly where near my house this species has been seen before. Lockie Malala said, many of our observations are at playgrounds or local council reserves which have been planted by councils. Does this mean that all our plant observations have to be set as not wild and will be casual and will not be useful to projects? So that's a good question. So if you know that a plant has been planted by the council, then yes, you have to, it's a good thing to label it as not wild. That's really important. That does not obviously include things like weeds or things like that. So if you're taking other photos within the same playground or the same park, which you know haven't been planted, then those are completely fine to mark as wild. If you do mark them as not wild, yes, they will be casual, but it doesn't mean that they won't be useful to any projects. Some projects definitely don't accept casual, but there are plenty of other projects that do accept casual observations. And another thing to consider is that when researchers go to use data, they can certainly use casual observations as well. So just because something is casual doesn't mean that it isn't useful. And certainly I've published 4 or 5 papers already using iNaturalist data. I've got another 4 or 5 I'm writing at the moment. And for multiple of those papers, I have used casual observations from people. So certainly don't let that be something that affects whether you take photos of things or not. Yes, sorry, I missed that question. I meant to answer that earlier from Locking Lala. So they said, is it best to identify?
There's probably one more after that and then go back to that one. Sorry.
Which one is this the best to identify the genus family?
No, scroll down. What if the council planted the original plant more than 20 years ago and it spawned many other babies surrounding it? So it continues on from the last question.
So that's a fantastic question. So if they planted the original plant more than 20 years ago, then that one is still counted as not wild. But if other plants have self-seeded from that original one, then those count as wild. That is perfectly okay. So if you have a jacaranda tree that is planted, so for example, I have a jacaranda tree next door in my neighbor's yard, and that was planted by them. So if I was to take a photo of that, it would be I would have to label it as not wild, and it would be casual. But then if a bird comes along or some kind of animal or the wind, to be honest, I have no idea how jacarandas spread their seeds. I think it might actually be wind. So let's say the wind spreads their seed and it goes down into my front yard, and then a new little jacaranda sapling pops up. That one counts as wild. That is perfectly fine because that is self-seeded. So if you have something that has not been directly planted, that is perfectly okay to label as wild. And then as a kind of a follow-up, Lukeman said, what about a huge old gum tree on my property that predates us? So if that gum tree, even if it is 100 years old, if you know for certain that it was planted by someone, it still needs to be marked as not wild. But if it was there of its own accord, then it definitely counts as wild. But the way that iNaturalist works, it doesn't matter what the time period is. If you've got an oak tree that is 200 years old, but you know it was planted by someone, then ideally it should be marked as not wild. And that's the best case that you should do. And then going back to the other question was, is it best to identify the genus/family or better to tag an expert to identify the species level? So it's perfectly okay to identify to those coarser levels. So, and that's certainly a good way to go about things. So if I'm unsure about something that I've ID'd, I could probably take a stab at the species, but maybe I'm wrong. So a good way to do it is to just ID to a genus or family that I'm confident about. And then, yep, exactly as you say, I can tag an expert to identify the species level. And the way to find experts, and this is what I'll quickly jump in before I go to the projects, because I assume I'm rapidly running out of time. If I go back to my Explore tab and we go back to searching for butterflies in Greater Sydney, you can click this third tab, which says identifiers. And this now shows you all the top identifiers of butterflies in Greater Sydney. So this is where you find your experts. So if I had a butterfly that I had seen in Greater Sydney and I didn't know what it was, I would tag Peter here, whose username is P. Ewan, because he is an absolute whiz with butterflies. So this is the way, and you can kind of scroll down and you can see who all the top identifiers are. And that's a really good way of doing things. Okay, we've got less than 5 minutes to go, so we'll jump into projects here. So projects are a really important way of getting your observations seen more by other people. So this is one of the things that I mentioned way at the beginning of this workshop, of one of the ways of getting your things ID'd is adding them to projects. Now, there are 2 main types of project. There are traditional projects and collection projects. Collection projects, you don't have to do anything. So they are set up to automatically collect your observations, assuming that your observations fulfill the requirements and the filters of that project. So, for example, I will go to a collection project that I'm a part of. This one. Okay. So Australian orthopteroids. So this is a collection project. And the way it's been set up is that if you have any observation that's in Australia and it's of any of these groups, either cockroaches and termites, web spinners, praying mantises, ice and rock crawlers, any kind of like grasshopper, cricket, or katydid, or stick insects, then it will automatically appear in the project and you don't have to do anything. So all you have to do is just automatically, all you have to do is upload your observation as normal of one of these groups. 1 second. So all you have to do is add your observation as you normally would. And because this is set up as a collection project, it will just automatically collect things for you, and it's completely fine. Other filters for collection projects include things like place filters or date filters, and that's what the BioBlitz project is. So the Great Southern BioBlitz is set up to be a collection project. So as long as you upload your observations within the area that has been specified and within, as long as you have observed it in those dates, the 22nd to the 25th, it will be automatically collected into that project, and it's completely fine. So keeping in mind for the Great Southern BioBlitz, you don't have to actually, 1 second. You don't have to actually manually add your observations to the Great Southern BioBlitz project. You just upload your observations as normal, and they'll go in, and it's perfectly fine. However, there are also projects that are traditional projects, and these require you to manually add your observations to them. So these are things that are set up to collect particular types of observations that you can't just have these automatic filters. These are things like, and so some of the big ones are the environment recovery projects. I'll get that. Environment recovery, and I'll just give a few quick examples. And then we've got wild pollinators. We'll go to that. Okay, so traditional projects, as I said, are ones that require you to manually add your observations to them. So for example, the wild pollinator count. So this is a project, a really cool project where if you see some kind of bee or fly or insect that is pollinating a plant, you can add your observations to it. And when you do add your observations, you'll then get prompted to add this additional information on what plant it was visiting and whether that plant was a native or a non-native plant. And I'll show you how to do that in 1 second with the, I'm sure I'm already over time, but with the 2 minutes I've got left. Another really cool traditional project is the environment recovery project. So if you go out to any area that has been affected by a bushfire and you then take photos of things that are recovering, you can upload your photos into the environment recovery project. So you can see that we've got almost 16,000 observations from all around Australia. So these are all records that have been taken in areas that were affected by bushfires. We've actually already published one scientific paper using this data. We've got a few more along the way as well. So this is a project that I'm a part of with the University of New South Wales. You've also got this Found Feathers project. So if you find feathers from a bird and you're really interested to figure out what bird they actually came from, you can actually upload your observations to this project. And there are some absolutely amazing users from around the world, particularly Karakaxa, who's from Greece, and Feather Enthusiast, who's from the US. And they can pretty much identify any bird from you just from the feathers, which is really amazing. So in the final, well, I'm already over time now.
We're over time, but you've got one more question in there, and that's from WW2980. How do you know which is a traditional project and which is a collection project?
Yep. Okay, awesome. So I'll answer that question, then I'll spend literally 1 minute explaining how to add your observations to traditional projects. So they look quite different. So you'll notice that the projects have a different view. So this is pretty much how to check. So if I go back to a collection one, so this is what a collection project will look like. It'll have this big colored box and a kind of a cover photo here so you'll see that this cover photo only takes up a part of the top of the screen. And this part of the screen is a description of what the project is. You'll then see this view, recent observations. you'll see these little leaderboards. You'll scroll down, you'll see this, and then you'll see the map. Whereas traditional projects look like this. They look a bit different. You'll see that this cover photo takes up the entire space. It doesn't have this little observation box here, the little description box. It has the totals in this bar here, which you'll see isn't present here. The leaderboards look a bit different. It goes straight to the map. It actually shows you this little bar here. The about, so the description, which is up here, is actually down here. You can write journal posts, which are here. So pretty much it's just you have to have a look at it and see. You'll notice if I go to this traditional project, it's the same layout as this one. This traditional project is the same layout. So finally, as my last little second thing, how to add things to projects. You can do it both as you're uploading and retrospectively. So let's say I go back here. I've got my beetle ready to upload and I want to add it to a project. All I have to do is go to the left-hand side of the screen here. I click in this projects bar, click in that bar, and you'll see all my traditional projects appear. Collection projects won't appear on this list because you cannot manually add things to them because, as I said, it just automatically goes into them. So this is a list of all the traditional projects I'm a part of, and then all I would have to do is add the correct one, and this will now be in that project. You can also add things retrospectively. So say this is an observation that I already uploaded earlier. I want to add it to a project. I just scroll down on the right-hand side of the screen here. You'll see there's a bar which says projects. I just click in the bar and do exactly the same thing. And I click on one of these projects and it'll get added. So as one example, if I wanted to add it, so let's say this beetle was pollinating a plant. I would scroll down. I would click wild pollinator count. I get this window, which is where I can add what plant was the pollinator visiting. Was it a native or an exotic plant? I just click add for both of those. I click add the project and your observation is now in the project. So I think, yep, I will certainly wrap things up there because I've gone dramatically over time as usual. But if anyone's got any last second questions, I'm more than happy to field those. Otherwise, if there's anything you're still uncertain about, I'm more than happy for you to message me at any time whatsoever on iNaturalist. I'm the Beachcomber, or flick me an email, and I'm able to help you out with anything at any time whatsoever.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I've just put in the chat as well a link to our YouTube channel, just to let you know that all of our videos that Thomas have done so far and that the rest of us have done are actually on our YouTube channel. So go and have a look at that. If you're running your own BioBlitz in your Great Southern BioBlitz in your area and you're not sure how to use Twitter or Facebook or anything else like that, those how-to guides are also on there, as well as Thomas's how to use iNaturalist guides, both intermediate and beginner. If I can just give a virtual round of applause for Thomas. Round like this is all good. Thank you very much, Thomas, for that. And we hope everyone has enjoyed their evening.